Somewhere in the heart of China, there is a bloodline that should not exist. For 1,000 years, a small community quietly lit candles on Friday nights. They refused to eat pork. They wore blue caps instead of white ones. They called themselves the descendants of Israel, in a country where almost nobody had heard that name. For centuries, scholars dismissed their story as legend. Missionaries who found them in the 1800s thought they were looking at a hoax. But in the last few years, something extraordinary happened. Scientists finally cracked the code hidden inside their DNA. And what they found did not just confirm an old legend, it rewrote the entire timeline of how Judaism traveled across the ancient world. This is the story of the Kaifeng Jews and the 1,000-year mystery that modern genetics just solved. Kaifeng sits in central China, along the banks of the Yellow River. Today, it is a quiet provincial city, but 1,000 years ago, it was one of the richest cities on Earth. During the Song dynasty, Kaifeng was the capital of all China. It had over 1 million residents. It sat at the eastern end of the Silk Road. Merchants, monks, and travelers from Persia, India, and Central Asia poured into its markets every single day. Somewhere in that flood of traders, a small group of Jewish merchants arrived. Nobody knows the exact year they first stepped through the city gates, but we do know they built something permanent. In 1163, this community built a synagogue in Kaifeng. That date comes from a stone tablet, a stele, carved in the year 1489. The stele told the story of their arrival for future generations to read. It said their ancestors came from the west, following the trade routes, bringing with them Torah scrolls and a memory of Jerusalem. For centuries afterward, the synagogue stood in the middle of the city. Chinese emperors sometimes gifted incense and silk to the community. Some Kaifeng Jews rose to extraordinary heights in Chinese society. Historians believe the earliest wave of settlers likely arrived sometime during the Song dynasty, possibly even earlier. Some traders may have first passed through the ancient city of Xi'an, a major hub near the western edge of China, before eventually pushing further east toward Kaifeng. From there, the community grew slowly, generation by generation. They kept their own dietary laws. They avoided pork completely, a habit so distinct that it set them apart from almost everyone around them. Locals eventually gave them a nickname that roughly translates to the sect that removes the sinew, a reference to the Jewish practice of removing certain tendons from meat before eating it, based on ancient Torah law. This nickname alone tells us something important. It tells us their religious practices were visible enough and unusual enough that ordinary Chinese neighbors noticed and remembered them for generations. Unlike Jewish communities in Europe, the Kaifeng Jews were never persecuted. There were no ghettos. There were no expulsions. There were no pogroms. Instead, they were welcomed into the highest levels of Chinese government, members of the community, passed the brutal imperial examinations, the test that decided who could serve as government officials. Several Kaifeng Jews became respected scholars and civil servants. The community was proud of this. They displayed gifts from emperors as symbols of honor. In many ways, they lived a life that Jewish communities almost anywhere else in the world could only dream of. To this day, historians point out that China remains one of the only nations in the world with no recorded history of state-sponsored persecution against Jewish people. No forced conversions, no mass expulsions ordered by an emperor, no riots targeting Jewish neighborhoods. For a people who had experienced repeated waves of persecution, almost everywhere else on Earth, China genuinely stood apart as a place of relative safety and acceptance. But this success came with a hidden cost. In many countries, persecution actually helped Jewish communities preserve their identity. When a community is pushed to the margins, it clings tighter to its traditions. In China, the opposite happened. Because the Kaifeng Jews were so deeply accepted, they slowly began to blend in. They started intermarrying with their Chinese neighbors. Over generations, their features changed, their language changed. Hebrew, once used in prayer, became a mystery, even to the people praying with it. Floods along the Yellow River made things worse. Kaifeng was hit by devastating floods multiple times over the centuries. One especially catastrophic flood struck in the 1600s, destroying much of the synagogue and damaging sacred texts. Rebuilding efforts happened, but the community was shrinking. Rabbis died without replacements. Nobody left to teach the next generation how to read the Torah scrolls properly. By the 1800s, the synagogue had crumbled into ruins. When Western missionaries and travelers finally rediscovered the community, they found people who still called themselves Jewish, who still avoided pork, who still remembered fragments of stories about Moses and Jerusalem, but they could no longer read Hebrew. They no longer had a functioning synagogue. Their religious practice had all but disappeared. Imagine being a member of that community in the final years before the synagogue collapsed. You know you're different. Your family still refuses pork at every meal. Your grandmother still whispers half-remembered phrases that nobody can fully translate, scroll read properly in your own lifetime. You have never met a rabbi. your connection to Judaism has become something closer to inherited memory than actual practice. This is exactly the situation Western missionaries stumbled into when they rediscovered the Kaifeng Jews in the 19th century. They found a people clinging to an identity with almost none of the tools left to fully express it. Word of the discovery spread through Jewish communities across the world. Letters and reports traveled from China back to Europe and the Middle East, describing this strange, isolated pocket of Jewish identity, surviving quietly for centuries without any contact with the outside Jewish world. Some visitors brought books, some brought prayer materials, some tried to help rebuild what had been lost, but by then, the damage from centuries of assimilation was difficult to reverse. The Kaifeng Jews had survived, but survival and preservation are not always the same thing. This is where the mystery deepens. If you strip away religion, if you strip away language, what is actually left to prove someone's ancestry? For over a century, historians could only guess. Some believed the Kaifeng community descended from the 10 lost tribes of Israel, exiled thousands of years ago. Others pointed to the Bar Kokhba revolt against Rome in the 2nd century, suggesting refugees fled all the way to China after that failed uprising. Still others insisted the real story was much simpler. Jewish traders from Persia walking the Silk Road for business, some of whom settled down and never left. Each theory had its own supporters. Each theory sounded plausible on the surface. The 10 Lost Tribes theory appealed to people fascinated by ancient biblical prophecy, including a famous line from the book of Isaiah describing exiles returning from a distant land, sometimes translated as Sinim, a word some enthusiastically linked to China. Most serious biblical scholars reject that specific connection, but the theory still captured public imagination for generations. The Bar Kokhba theory appealed to historians who study the aftermath of Roman persecution, imagining desperate refugees fleeing east after a catastrophic military defeat. And the Silk Road merchant theory appealed to anyone who understood just how much cultural and economic exchange actually flowed along those ancient trade networks. Without hard genetic evidence, there was simply no way to know which version, if any, was actually true. Before you keep watching, if stories like this fascinate you, hit that subscribe button now so you never miss one of these deep dives. For a long time, there was no way to settle the debate. Oral traditions can be beautiful, but they can also be unreliable. Stories change over generations. Details get exaggerated or lost. Historians needed something more solid than memory. They needed evidence written into the body itself. And that evidence finally arrived with the rise of modern genetic testing. The first real DNA testing on the Kaifeng descendants happened back in the 1980s. At that time, researchers could only examine a very limited set of genetic markers. The tools were primitive compared to what scientists have today. Still, those early results were promising. They suggested a genuine connection to Middle Eastern populations. No, just a coincidence or a cultural myth. That early confirmation was enough to reignite global interest in the Kaifeng story. Jewish organizations around the world began paying closer attention. An Israel-based group called Shavei Israel started reaching out to descendants, offering to help them reconnect with their heritage. In 2016, 5 young Kaifeng descendants made Aliyah, officially immigrating to Israel as recognized members of the Jewish people. But recognition from an organization is not the same as scientific proof. The bigger genetic mystery remained unsolved. Where exactly did these ancestors come from? Persia? Iraq? India? Central Asia? The early tests were too blunt to answer that question with real precision. Scientists needed deeper data. They needed to compare Kaifeng lineages against a massive, detailed database of Jewish populations from around the world. That kind of database simply did not exist yet, not until very recently. This is where the modern breakthrough begins. A research initiative called the Avatainu Project set out to build the most complete genetic map of Jewish ancestry ever assembled. Since the year 2000, this project has collected DNA data from over 10,000 participants. Most of the early data came from Ashkenazi Jewish communities, the largest and most studied Jewish population in the world. But starting in 2016, the researchers shifted focus. They began actively searching out and testing individuals from smaller, lesser-known Jewish communities scattered across the globe. Bukharan Jews from Central Asia, Kurdish Jews from Iraq, and eventually, descendants connected to the ancient Kaifeng community. What makes this project so different from earlier attempts is scale and precision. Earlier tests in the 1980s and even in the early 2000s were working with tiny amounts of genetic data compared to what is available today. Back then, scientists could only compare a handful of genetic markers, almost like trying to identify a person from a single blurry photograph. Today, researchers can examine thousands of genetic markers at once, creating something closer to a full, high-resolution portrait of a person's ancestry. That leap in technology is the entire reason this mystery finally became solvable. The method these scientists used is fascinating in its own right. They focused unchanged for thousands of years. Because it travels almost unaltered down the male line, Y-DNA acts like a genetic fingerprint stretching back through countless generations. Researchers started with what is called a Y37 panel, a broad genetic scan designed to detect potential ancestral lineages. When a lineage looked promising or unusual, they went much deeper. They ran next-generation sequencing, a far more advanced technique capable of pinpointing extremely specific genetic connections between individuals separated by centuries or even millennia. And here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. The researchers were not even trying to solve the Kaifeng mystery when they found their answer. They were testing men from Bukharan and Kurdish Jewish communities for an entirely separate part of the project. But buried inside that unrelated data, they noticed something remarkable. Certain genetic markers connected directly back to the lineages already recorded among Kaifeng descendants. The breakthrough came sideways, almost by accident, the way many of the greatest scientific discoveries tend to happen. Two major Y-DNA lineages of West Eurasian origin turned up among the Kaifeng descendants. One of them belongs to a specific genetic cluster within a larger lineage known as haplogroup J. This particular branch has also been found in a Kurdish Jewish individual whose family traces back to Iraqi Kurdistan. Scientists were able to estimate when the most recent shared ancestor between these two lineages actually lived. Their calculations point to somewhere around the year 550, with a wide statistical range stretching from several centuries before that date to well over 1,000 years afterward. That same genetic cluster also connects to individuals of Iraqi, Arab, and Qatari background, as well as a related lineage found in Lebanon. To put that time frame into perspective, the year 550 falls well before the rise of Islam, well before the founding of the Tang dynasty in China, and centuries before the first recorded synagogue was even built in Kaifeng. This suggests the ancestral lineage that eventually reached China had already been established in the Middle East for generations, before any member of that family line ever set foot on the Silk Road. The migration itself likely happened gradually, family by family, trade caravan by trade caravan, over the course of centuries, rather than in one single dramatic journey. Think about what that actually means. A man living in Kaifeng, China today, can trace part of his direct paternal lineage back to ancestors who once lived somewhere in the region, spanning modern-day Iraq and the surrounding Middle East. Not through legend, not through oral tradition passed down and altered over 1,000 years, through hard, measurable biological evidence written directly into human chromosomes. This finding lines up almost perfectly with what the Kaifeng community always claimed about themselves. Their oral history insisted that their ancestors were Jewish traders from Persia who traveled the Silk Road. The genetic data does not contradict that story. It reinforces it and adds a level of geographics precision nobody expected. The evidence increasingly points toward Mizrahi Jewish traders, meaning Jews whose ancestral roots trace to the Middle East rather than Europe, as the true founders of the Kaifeng community. These were very likely merchants who set out from cities like Bukhara or regions within ancient Persia, following established Silk Road trade networks eastward, eventually settling permanently in Kaifeng sometime before the 12th century. This also finally helps explain the earlier confusion surrounding Kaifeng ancestry. For decades, some researchers loosely connected the community to Armenian, Iranian, and Iraqi Jewish populations without much specificity. Now, with far more advanced testing methods, scientists can trace individual genetic branches with remarkable accuracy. It is no longer a vague regional connection. It is a specific, traceable lineage linked to real historical migration patterns along one of the most important trade routes in human history. Of course, DNA tells only part of the story. As some researchers point out, Chinese Jewish identity today is not a single uniform category. Centuries of intermarriage mean that most Kaifeng descendants carry a significant amount of Han Chinese ancestry alongside their Jewish paternal lineage. Genetically speaking, they are a blend shaped by 1,000 years of life inside one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. But that blend does not erase the deeper truth the DNA reveals. It confirms that somewhere, generations ago, real Jewish men from the Middle East walked the Silk Road all the way into the heart of China, married local women, and built a lasting community that somehow survived 1,000 years of history. If you think about the scale of what just happened here, it is honestly staggering. A community almost lost to time, reduced by floods, assimilation, and centuries without a functioning synagogue, has finally had its origin story confirmed by hard science. Stories that sounded like folklore for hundreds of years turned out to be remarkably accurate. The Silk Road really did carry more than just silk and spices. It carried people, culture, and religious identity across thousands of miles, planting roots that somehow held on for a millennium.